Audism in Healthcare. Hi, my name's Ellie, and I'm the founder and CEO of Deaf Hub Bendigo. We're so proud to be partnering with Auslan Consultancy to produce this documentary focusing on the experiences of deaf and hard of hearing people living in rural and remote settings. We were keen to compare the levels of access and equity experienced by regional deaf and hard of hearing people when compared with their hearing peers. After conducting video interviews, it soon became obvious that this group experienced huge disadvantage when interacting with the healthcare system. This included access to health information, access to interpreters, and informed consent. We followed two individuals who shared their experiences to help highlight these issues. I remember back when I was 16, I became extremely ill and was sent to hospital with pancreatitis. The hospital had an on-call system, so Mum and I presented to the emergency department. I can't say that I remember the whole thing very well. Well, I was terribly sick at the time, but what I do remember was that Mum was very stressed. She was forced to switch between being a concerned mum and looking after a sick daughter, and also interpreting everything that the doctors were saying so that I could be informed. Whether that meant giving permission for procedures, medication, or just to try and work out what was wrong. The hospital said that they'd booked an interpreter, but they never came. So it was up to Mum to be on call to interpret for my entire stay, which lasted a week. This kind of thing always happens at hospitals. Another time 2 years ago, I had my tonsils removed. Once again, there was no interpreter, so Mum had to step in. The hospital originally refused to let Mum into the pre-op room, where I was to sign consent forms and have the procedure explained to me. Well, you'd expect an interpreter to be there, explaining what was going on, right up until you go under and enter the theatre. But because the only person I had to interpret for me was my mum, they wouldn't let her in. I finally managed to convince them to let Mum come with me as far as the theatre door. There was another time after that I needed to have a general anaesthetic for some tests that I was having done. Well, this time there was an interpreter, from start to finish. They were allowed in the theatre with me and were able to relay everything that was happening, what the medical staff were saying, what medications would be used, everything. I remember seeing them signing right up until I went under, and when I woke, they were there. Doctor's appointments are much the same. Living out here in a regional area, there's just not enough interpreters. I've had to cancel so many appointments because there wasn't an interpreter. Sometimes I don't even bother cancelling, and I'll try my luck with the pen and paper. It takes longer, and sometimes the communication breaks down. Maybe I'm tired that day, or I can't think of the right word to write. Then the doctor doesn't understand me and misinterprets what I'm trying to say. I had an ultrasound appointment and there were no interpreters available. With no other option, my partner and I decided to try using a video remote interpreter. It was really tricky though, because I was lying on the bed, the radiologist was on my right, and my partner, well, he should have been on my left, but then I wouldn't be able to see the interpreter on the screen. So my partner had to stand at the end of the bed with the phone in his hand, where the interpreter would usually stand. Well, the tiny screen moved around and it was hard to see, but also the interpreter and the technician, they couldn't hear each other clearly, even with the volume all the way up, which meant some parts of the conversation got missed. Also, with my partner holding the phone at his chest, we couldn't both see the interpreter at the same time. We both would have preferred a face-to-face interpreter so that we could say what we wanted to say and communicate with the radiologist. I argued a lot with my family because I was fighting for my rights. I wanted to know everything that was going on with Mum, and they just refused. They didn't want me to know the full story, and I said, you know what? She's my mum and I need to know. Mum was such an important person in my life, and we were extremely close. She was my best friend, and we did so much together. So I insisted that the doctor tell me absolutely everything. All of the details, from A all the way to Z. I was finally able to make that happen, and I remember sitting at the hospital and my sister, well, she wasn't happy. Well, bad luck, I thought, because I was going to keep advocating to get all the information that I could. The doctor explained what was happening, and I knew that it didn't matter if I cried. I mean, of course you would. Who wouldn't in that situation? I had a support person who was interpreting for me, and finally the situation was clearly explained. I understood more about Mum's illness, her situation, and what was going on for her. Mum had said that she wanted me to know what was happening, so I told her that I would make that happen, and I did. I always thought that she'd be alright though. I mean, she was on medication and she was doing okay. But when I asked the doctor about her doing chemo, he said that she wasn't well enough. She continued taking the medication, but it didn't work. There were side effects, but still no improvements. She stayed stable for a while, but then the doctor told us that she wasn't getting any better, and he said that she wouldn't recover. That feeling, no words can explain it. And the rest of my family, well, they'd known all of this since April. But being deaf, I'm always the last person to know everything. And it's the same old story. It wasn't until about halfway through it all that I was finally brought up to speed. But they'd known all of this the whole time. I guess they thought that they didn't have time to explain it to me.
It goes right back to when I first came to Bendigo in 1981. There were no interpreting services in Bendigo. None. And there was no deaf society in Bendigo. So most deaf people just didn't bother about having interpreters because they couldn't access interpreters. I don't know how they survived. Most of them would take a family member with them to interpret for them.
When she passed away, I really struggled. I was so angry. I screamed and I couldn't stop crying. I fought with my family and I pushed people away. I was just so angry. When it came to the funeral, well, I refused to go. Eventually my family said that I had to, because if I didn't, I would regret it. When I first arrived, I had to go and see a doctor. Coming from South Africa, they have to make sure that you're inoculated and not at risk of bringing diseases from overseas. They want to keep people safe, so I went to see a doctor at the refugee centre. And they gave me a checkup, and then they started giving me these injections. There was an interpreter there, but I really couldn't make out what they were signing. Even though they knew some international sign, I still couldn't completely understand them. I nodded along, but I was really confused. I continued getting the vaccinations, and they tried to show me things in written English, but that wasn't accessible for me. I still had no idea what they were injecting me with. They kept trying to write in English, and I kept insisting that they get an interpreter. Language was a huge barrier, and I got so confused. Sunraysia Mallee Ethnic Council, well, they wouldn't book an interpreter. They didn't understand that it was their responsibility to provide one, or what a deaf person might need. So I was very lost. I didn't know what was happening most of the time. It was like they'd never seen a deaf person before. They just kept trying to write in English, but I couldn't understand. It wasn't until they sent me to an audiologist to have my hearing checked that they finally understood that I'd grown up profoundly deaf. I tried to explain all of this to them. I wanted to know what was going on, and I needed an interpreter to relay what was happening in a visual way so that I could understand and so that I could express my needs too. With an interpreter, I have access. I can communicate and I can be included. But without one, I can't understand what's happening and I feel depressed. When I first arrived, the doctors, well, they treated me like I could hear. They didn't believe me. They just didn't get it. It wasn't until much later, after I'd shown the doctor the audiologist report, then they finally understood I'm completely deaf, and we went from there.
When I was at Bendigo Senior, one of my female students was playing football with the boys, and the football came down and just hit her on the finger, and the finger broke there and there. It was like a figure Z. And she was rushed off to hospital, of course. I couldn't go with her because I was at the school interpreting. Her family didn't think an interpreter was necessary. And I got a call from the hospital 2 days later to say, please come. She is crying hysterically. And I came down and said, what's the matter? And they said, the girl said to me, they're going to cut my finger off. So we called the doctors in, what's going on? And what had happened was that 2 doctors had come in to have a look at the finger. It was in plaster. And they said to each other, that plaster looks too tight. We're going to have to cut it off. And they got her hand and they said, yeah, we'll just cut it off around here, take it off and then replace it. And she thought they were going to cut the finger off, not the plaster. That's one story.
Well, I always thought that I'd give birth naturally and be able to hold my baby straight away, just like anybody else. I imagined there'd be an interpreter there, my mum, my partner, but yeah. And of course, I was so looking forward to meeting my boy. I'd had a really good pregnancy and I felt that we'd bonded. Each appointment at the hospital had been a good experience. The staff would make adjustments for me and they always made sure there was an interpreter. Everything had been going great until it all went into chaos. From what I can remember, I was in labour for about 8 hours and I'd had 1 epidural. Then they offered me a top-up. Looking back, the first mistake was that they didn't bring the interpreter in at that time. There was 1 interpreter on site, but they were on a break. At that moment, it didn't matter. I wanted to get on with it and get the top up then and there, and I didn't want to wait. The doctor really should have brought the interpreter in anyway, but that didn't happen. So I had the second epidural, but what went wrong was that the person who performed the top-up was a different person than the one who'd administered the initial dose, and they didn't actually read my medical records properly. They didn't realise I'd already had a full dose, and instead of giving me a partial top-up, they administered another full epidural. Not only that, but they accidentally inserted the instrument too far into my spinal cord. I remember the moment really well. It was like someone had stabbed a knife into my back. I'll never forget that feeling. It was just so awful. As soon as the instrument was taken out, I could feel that something was wrong. Mum was there and I told her that something didn't feel right. She told me not to move because I'd been sitting up when this had happened and had started to jump forward. I kept saying, something's wrong, something's wrong. My mum, my sister, my partner, the nurse were in the room, and I said I needed to lay down. I could just feel that something wasn't right. My legs felt really strange and started to tingle. If anyone touched them, they felt awful. It was really weird. I really shouldn't have been able to feel my legs after the epidural, but I could. The doctors agreed to lay me down, and that's when I blacked out. I don't remember a thing after that until I woke up in the ICU. It was so strange, waking up in this white-walled room. From what people told me, I was awake and I looked over at my sister. Then I closed my eyes and it looked like I'd fallen asleep. They called a code blue and medical staff came rushing in. Doctors started administering CPR and I actually died for 4 minutes. That was because I'd been overdosed with the epidural and my spinal cord had been punctured. So I was dead for 4 minutes, but the CPR managed to bring me back. Then they rushed me to surgery to have an emergency cesarean. But in the elevator on the way to the theatre, I died again. I'd gone into cardiac arrest, had a heart attack, and my lungs had collapsed. I died in the lift for another 3 minutes, so all up I was dead for 7 minutes. After that they performed the cesarean, the baby was born, they took him away, and then they took me to the ICU where I was in a medically induced coma for 5 or 6 hours. So I woke up in this white room, and the first thing I remember seeing from my bed was lots of white walls. The blinds were closed and there was a big wide open door, and to the right of that was a whiteboard. In blue pen, someone had written, "A bouncing baby boy." As soon as I saw that, I reached down to touch my stomach and I was speechless. I was awake and alert, but I couldn't bring my hands to sign. I just kept feeling my stomach. Mum was there, and when she realised I'd woken up, she rushed over to comfort me. I had this big tube in my mouth so I couldn't speak either, which was really disorientating. I didn't know what the fuck was going on. I kept touching my belly and wondering where my baby was. Mum went and got the nurse who got me to cough so they could remove the tube from my mouth. Straight away I asked, "Where's my baby?" Mum said, "Don't worry, he's beautiful," and pulled out her phone to show me a photo. I took the phone and looked at this photo of a baby. He was being kept in the NICU. Mum wanted to talk to me, but all I could think about was my baby. Last thing I remembered was having this huge pregnant belly, but when I woke up in the ICU, it was flat. What the fuck had happened? I was swearing my head off, saying, "What the fuck happened? Where's my fucking baby? What the fuck is going on?" I remember Mum trying to calm me down and telling me that everything was alright, but no one would tell me what had happened. Mum messaged everyone to let them know that I'd woken up, and my sister was the first to get there. As soon as she came in, she started crying. Then my partner and the interpreter came in, and my partner rushed over to my side. No one was saying anything. I didn't know, but the doctor had told them not to tell me what had happened. That's because they wanted to see if I'd suffered any brain damage after my brain being without oxygen for a full 7 minutes. They thought maybe something could have gone wrong or that I'd be delayed in some way. But no, I think it was pretty clear that I was back to my normal self because I couldn't stop swearing. I remember looking up at my sister and saying, "Tell me what happened." "You died," she said. Well, everyone started looking at each other and I caught my partner glaring at my sister as if to tell her not to say anything. "I died?" I said. "What the fuck? Where's my fucking baby?" I said it again and again. They'd given me some drugs as well, so I was pretty out of it. I always imagined I'd give birth and be able to hold my baby straight away, not 10 hours later. When I was finally able to meet him, I couldn't believe that he was mine. I kept asking, "Is he really my baby?" and kept being told that he was. So I had a bit of a breakdown. He had to stay overnight in the NICU because of low blood sugar, and I had to cope with him not being with me. I'd only been able to meet him for about an hour, a half hour maybe. I was completely exhausted. They took me to my room and my partner and I slept. The next day they brought River in and we stayed there for a week. From what I can remember, they did ask me if I wanted to wait for the interpreter to finish their break or if I wanted to go ahead with the top-up. My sister and my mum must have interpreted that part for me. At that point, I didn't care. I was in a world of pain and I just wanted it done. Looking back, I really should have insisted that they went and got the interpreter. I think the interpreter would have been more assertive on my behalf. My mum did used to work as an interpreter, but when she interprets for me, well, I guess I've noticed, and I don't mean this in a bad way, but she's a bit out of practice. So when she voices for me, it's different from how another interpreter would do it. I think that if the interpreter was in her place, they would have noticed how serious I was and conveyed the urgency of what I was saying loud and clear. That's one thing. Maybe that could have made a difference. During our travels, we heard so many people's stories, and I can't help but feel that as deaf people, we face such extreme disadvantage. Access in general is far from equal. We're living now in 2022, so why does it feel like we're still living in the 1500s? We have uncovered many similar stories, and what we've found is that these experiences aren't limited to just healthcare settings. Our other stories expose barriers faced in education, employment, relationships, and many other avenues of life. So, I want to ask you a question. Who is accountable? Is it deaf organisations to advocate for our rights? Is it the wider hearing community making adjustments or legislative change? Who's listening to us? How can we work together to make change? You and me, collectively pushing forward. We are all responsible.